America's about to go to war. And when she goes to war, she wants black and brown bodies. Now you're useful.
Over the past hours, tensions involving Iran have intensified sharply. Leaders are speaking in deterrence language, and markets are reacting. Iranian state media and major international outlets are reporting that Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei has been killed, and that changes everything. But what if we tell you Africa needs to be conscious too? You must wonder, if this confrontation is unfolding thousands of kilometers away, why should Africans be paying close attention right now? Then you must also ask, are Africans and black migrants in the wider region about to become the invisible casualties of someone else's escalation? And why is your economy being affected? Why are oil prices already twitching? Why are shipping routes under review? Why are currency analysts suddenly cautious? There are things you need to know before it gets too late. Let's get into it. The escalation point was not a single explosion. It was a sequence, and Africa is already inside that sequence, whether it realizes it or not. This is not just about oil and markets. There are African nationals living and working across the wider region, in construction sites, logistics hubs, hospitals, and energy facilities. In every major regional escalation, migrant communities often become the quiet, vulnerable layer of the crisis. So when tensions rise, the question isn't only geopolitical, it is personal. We know military activity involving Iran intensified within a compressed window of time. Security advisories expanded. Regional airspace restrictions followed. Strategic assets were repositioned. Public statements from global leaders hardened in tone. None of these moves alone signals a world war, but together they signal entry into a high-risk phase. And high-risk phases are exactly the kind that send economic tremors toward emerging regions first. When leaders begin speaking in deterrence language, it matters. Warnings about decisive responses and declarations that aggression will not go unanswered are not casual diplomatic phrases. They are calculated signals, crafted not only for opponents, but for allies, investors, energy traders, and military planners.
Our objective is to defend the American people by eliminating imminent threats from the Iranian regime, a vicious group of very hard, terrible people.
They indicate that red lines are no longer theoretical, and when red lines become visible, miscalculation becomes possible. This region is not just another geopolitical theater. It sits at the crossroads of global energy supply, strategic maritime corridors, military alliances, and power competition between major states. The infrastructure threaded through this geography underpins a significant portion of the global economy. When instability touches that infrastructure, downstream economies feel it, including those far from the battlefield. Markets understood this immediately. Within hours of the latest developments, energy futures reflected increased volatility. Risk premiums began creeping upward. Analysts shifted from routine commentary to scenario modeling. The language moved from localized tension to containment risk. That shift in vocabulary matters, because markets don't wait for a confirmed catastrophe, they price in probability. And when probability shifts in a region that influences oil flows, trade corridors, and financial confidence, investors and insurers begin recalculating exposure. African economies are particularly sensitive to this recalculation. Many are import-dependent. Many operate with narrow fiscal margins. Many are still stabilizing from post-pandemic debt expansion and inflation cycles, which means volatility does not hit them as background noise. It hits them as pressure. But beyond markets, something else is unfolding. Military posturing in this zone tends to draw in external powers quickly. Defense alliances are activated. Intelligence coordination intensifies. Naval patrol patterns adjust. Strategic signaling multiplies. Even if the confrontation remains geographically limited, the diplomatic atmosphere tightens globally. And when the diplomatic atmosphere tightens, emerging regions are rarely left untouched. This is where the shift becomes structural rather than theatrical. High-intensity rhetoric, combined with visible force positioning, creates a psychological effect across the global system. Governments initiate contingency planning. Corporations reassess supply chain resilience. Energy importers evaluate reserves. Shipping companies assess rerouting scenarios. This is not dramatic television. It is systemic recalibration. And once recalibration begins, it rarely reverses overnight. The crucial point is this: escalation is not defined solely by missiles or troop movements. It is defined by the convergence of military signaling, hardened rhetoric, and immediate market response. When those elements align, volatility enters the bloodstream of the global economy. The Middle East has experienced tension before, but this cycle is unfolding in a world already strained by fragile supply chains, elevated sovereign debt, and inflation-sensitive developing markets. That combination amplifies transmission speed. So the question is no longer whether the situation is serious. The real question is this: if volatility is already spreading through energy markets, how quickly will it begin tightening the economic arteries that many African economies depend on? The reason volatility travels so quickly is simple. Energy is the bloodstream of the global economy, and this escalation is happening near one of its most sensitive arteries. Iran sits along the northern edge of the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow maritime corridor through which roughly 1/5 of the world's traded oil passes every single day. This is not symbolic geography, it is mechanical leverage. Tankers carrying crude oil and liquefied natural gas move through that corridor toward Asia, Europe, and beyond. Any perceived threat to its stability triggers immediate reactions in global energy markets. Notice the word perceived. The strait does not need to be closed for prices to rise. It only needs to look uncertain. Energy markets operate on anticipation. Traders calculate risk in advance. If tension increases, they assume higher insurance costs, potential delays, or worst-case disruption scenarios. Futures contracts adjust accordingly. Even small percentage increases in crude prices ripple across supply chains worldwide. For African economies, that ripple is not abstract. Many African countries import refined petroleum products. Even oil-producing states often import refined fuel due to limited domestic refining capacity. When global crude prices climb, transport costs increase. When transport costs increase, goods become more expensive, food distribution becomes costlier, electricity generation, especially where diesel or fuel oil is used, becomes more burdensome. Energy shocks are not isolated events. They compound. If oil prices remain elevated for weeks, governments must either absorb the cost through subsidies or pass it to consumers. Absorption strains public finances, passing costs on fuels inflation. Either path carries political consequences. And here is where exposure becomes uneven. Some African oil exporters may benefit from higher crude revenues in the short term. Increased export income can temporarily strengthen fiscal positions. But even these states face volatility risk. Higher prices can reduce global demand over time. Currency fluctuations can offset gains. And domestic fuel subsidy systems can still create internal pressure. Meanwhile, oil-importing African economies feel the squeeze immediately. Higher fuel costs push up the price of moving goods from ports to cities, from cities to rural markets. Agricultural inputs, especially fertilizer, which is energy-intensive to produce, become more expensive. Construction costs rise. Manufacturing margins tighten. This is how escalation in one narrow waterway becomes an inflationary factor thousands of kilometers away. But energy is not only about price, it is also about confidence. If investors perceive that energy routes are unstable, they reassess exposure not only in oil markets, but in countries heavily dependent on imported energy. That reassessment can influence credit ratings, bond yields, and currency stability. In other words, oil volatility does not remain inside commodity charts. It seeps into fiscal calculations and macroeconomic outlooks. And the deeper question now becomes unavoidable. If energy risk is already reverberating through markets, what happens next when shipping routes and trade corridors begin factoring in that same volatility? What happens next is not theoretical, it is logistical. When energy volatility persists, shipping companies begin adjusting their calculations. Risk assessment expands beyond fuel prices to maritime safety, insurance exposure, and route predictability. The Middle East is not only an energy corridor, it is a trade crossroads linking Asia, Europe, and Africa through some of the world's busiest sea lanes. And Africa depends heavily on those arteries. Large volumes of African imports, including wheat, rice, machinery, industrial components, pharmaceuticals, and consumer goods, travel through maritime routes connected to the Red Sea and nearby shipping corridors. When geopolitical tension rises in that broader zone, insurers increase premiums for vessels operating in adjacent waters. Shipping firms then pass those higher costs to importers. This is not dramatic, it is mechanical. A small increase in maritime insurance translates into higher freight rates. Higher freight rates raise import costs. Import costs feed into consumer prices. Over weeks and months, incremental increases accumulate into visible inflation. Consider food supply chains. Several African nations import a substantial share of their grain consumption. If shipping costs rise while global energy prices are already elevated, food import bills expand rapidly. Governments must decide whether to absorb the cost through public spending or allow market prices to adjust upward. Both options carry risk. Absorption increases fiscal strain. Adjustment increases public frustration. Trade strain also affects industrial growth. Manufacturing sectors across Africa depend on imported machinery and intermediate goods. If supply chains become less predictable or more expensive, production slows. Projects are delayed. Investment decisions are reconsidered. Even infrastructure development can feel the pressure. Construction materials sourced internationally become costlier to move. Financing timelines stretch as contractors account for volatility. Private investors become cautious in uncertain shipping environments. And beyond goods, there is confidence. Global trade operates on predictability. When a strategic region becomes unstable, global corporations reassess exposure to markets perceived as vulnerable to secondary effects. That reassessment can influence future investment decisions, especially in economies still building resilience. Africa's growing integration into global trade networks has brought opportunity, but also exposure. The same connectivity that fuels growth also transmits shock. None of this requires a blockade or full-scale regional war. It only requires sustained tension that keeps insurers cautious and markets nervous. Because in the modern economy, even the anticipation of disruption reshapes behavior. And trade disruption does not operate in isolation. When shipping tightens and import costs rise, pressure inevitably shifts to financial markets and currencies. So if trade arteries are beginning to strain under geopolitical risk, what happens when investors respond by moving capital away from perceived vulnerability? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. When investors sense sustained geopolitical risk, they do not wait for certainty. They reposition. Global capital is mobile. It moves quickly across borders in response to perceived instability. When tension intensifies in a region central to energy and trade, financial markets shift toward what they consider safe. Funds flow into major reserve currencies and low-risk government bonds. Emerging markets, especially those dependent on external financing, often feel the withdrawal first. This is where the pressure becomes financial rather than logistical. If capital begins to exit emerging economies, currencies weaken. A weaker currency makes imports more expensive in local terms. Even if global commodity prices stabilize, depreciation alone can push domestic prices higher. Inflation accelerates not because goods vanished, but because purchasing power shrank. For African economies managing external debt, currency weakness also increases repayment burdens. Many sovereign debts and corporate obligations are denominated in foreign currency. When local currencies decline, the cost of servicing that debt rises in domestic terms. Fiscal space narrows, budget priorities tighten. This financial dimension operates quietly. It does not dominate headlines, but it reshapes national decision-making. Central banks may intervene to defend currencies. Interest rates may rise to retain investor confidence. Higher interest rates can stabilize exchange rates, but they also slow economic activity. Borrowing becomes more expensive for businesses. Expansion plans are postponed. Small enterprises feel credit tightening almost immediately. At the same time, international investors reassess portfolio exposure. Bond yields may rise to compensate for perceived risk. Higher yields increase borrowing costs for governments seeking to issue new debt. Infrastructure financing becomes more expensive. Development projects face recalculated timelines. The feedback loop forms quickly. Geopolitical tension fuels market uncertainty. Uncertainty prompts capital reallocation. Capital movement pressures currencies. Currency pressure feeds inflation and debt strain. Even countries geographically distant from the confrontation feel the adjustment through financial channels. It is important to understand that markets react not only to events, but to expectations. If the escalation appears prolonged, investors assume volatility will persist. That assumption becomes self-reinforcing. Risk premiums embed themselves into valuations. Financial contagion does not require battlefield expansion. It requires uncertainty. And in interconnected markets, uncertainty spreads faster than physical disruption. For African policymakers, this phase demands vigilance. Exchange rate management, inflation control, and debt sustainability become intertwined with global events far beyond national borders. Yet financial exposure is only one side of the story. Because beyond markets and balance sheets, there is a human layer tied directly to regional economic stability, one that rarely makes front-page geopolitical analysis. If capital flight tightens national budgets, what happens when economic instability begins to affect the livelihoods of millions of Africans working abroad? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. What happens is this. The shock travels through people before it shows up in policy papers. Across Gulf economies and the wider Middle East, millions of African workers are employed in construction, logistics, hospitality, healthcare, domestic services, and energy-linked industries. Every month, billions of dollars in remittances flow from those workers back to families across Nigeria, Kenya, Ethiopia, Ghana, Senegal, and beyond. In some countries, remittances account for a significant share of GDP. For countless households, they are the difference between stability and survival. When regional tension rises, even without widespread conflict, economic behavior shifts. Businesses delay expansion, infrastructure projects slow, tourism softens, corporate hiring freezes become more common, financial institutions tighten risk assessment. None of this requires direct fighting. It only requires uncertainty, and uncertainty affects labor markets. If companies in the region grow cautious, overtime shrinks, contract renewals become selective, wage growth stalls, aviation disruptions, even temporary ones, can complicate worker mobility. Small interruptions accumulate into meaningful financial strain. Remittances are not just foreign currency inflows. They are school fees paid on time. They are hospital bills settled without borrowing. They are small businesses funded from afar. When that flow slows, even slightly, the effect is immediate at the household level. The diaspora link creates a direct economic bridge between regional stability and African domestic life. There is another dimension here as well: currency. If remittance inflows weaken while local currencies are already under pressure from capital flight, the strain compounds. Foreign exchange reserves become more sensitive. Governments monitor inflows more closely. Financial planners recalibrate assumptions. Unlike commodity exports, remittances are decentralized. They do not depend on state contracts. They depend on millions of individual employment relationships. That makes them resilient in many cases, but also sensitive to broader regional slowdowns. Moments of geopolitical tension can also affect migration policy. Governments in host countries may prioritize domestic stability. Regulatory environments can tighten. Labor demand can shift. Even subtle changes in visa policy or economic confidence can reshape worker opportunities over time. For African families, the stakes are immediate. For policymakers, the implications are structural. This is why regional escalation cannot be viewed as a distant theater. The economic threads are intertwined with daily life across the continent. Yet beyond households and remittances lies a broader arena where this escalation may reshape Africa's positioning: diplomacy. When financial systems tighten and diaspora flows face uncertainty, governments are forced to look outward to alliances, votes, and strategic balancing. So as economic and human connections strain under volatility, what happens diplomatically when global blocs begin to test loyalties and influence across emerging regions? What happens diplomatically is pressure. When major powers escalate, global politics does not remain neutral terrain. It hardens, alignments sharpen, words become signals, votes become statements, silence becomes strategic. In moments like this, international institutions turn into arenas of positioning. Resolutions carry more weight, abstentions are analyzed, bilateral meetings acquire new undertones, strategic partnerships are suddenly viewed through the lens of loyalty. Africa holds 54 votes in global forums. That number is not symbolic, it is arithmetic. In tightly divided geopolitical moments, arithmetic matters, and arithmetic attracts attention. Powerful states seek reassurance. They seek alignment. They seek diplomatic language that reinforces their narrative. Investment flows, defense cooperation, and development financing can all become part of broader geopolitical bargaining. This is not necessarily coercion. Sometimes it is an opportunity. Sometimes it is leverage, but it is rarely neutral. Periods of global confrontation elevate Africa's strategic relevance. Energy exporters matter more. Maritime states matter more. Countries with strategic mineral reserves matter more. Nations positioned along trade corridors matter more. Relevance can create bargaining power if managed carefully, but miscalculation can also create exposure. African governments now face layered decisions: how to protect economic stability while navigating global pressure, how to maintain diversified partnerships without triggering diplomatic backlash, how to use strategic positioning to secure investment without compromising autonomy. These decisions do not unfold in isolation. They interact with energy volatility, trade strain, currency pressure, and diaspora vulnerability, already discussed. That is why this escalation cannot be viewed as a distant crisis. It is a structural event inside a deeply interconnected system. And here is the final reality. The confrontation may de-escalate. It may stabilize into a tense equilibrium. It may evolve into a prolonged strategic rivalry rather than open conflict. But even if the battlefield remains contained, the geopolitical aftershocks are already traveling through markets, corridors, currencies, and alliances. Africa is not a spectator in this system. It is a participant, sometimes vulnerable, sometimes influential, always interconnected. The question is no longer whether the continent will feel the impact. The question is whether African policymakers, institutions, and citizens recognize the early signals and adjust fast enough to protect stability and maximize leverage. Because in global politics, timing is everything. And when volatility enters the system, those who anticipate early negotiate from strength, while those who react late absorb the cost. So as this escalation unfolds, and as global blocs test resolve and alignment, the ultimate question remains: will Africa merely endure the shockwaves or strategically position itself in the middle of a shifting world order? Let us know in the comments section what Africa should do now. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.